beef prices are soaring. This chart shows the average price of a pound of steak and ground beef over the past year. The beef category is up around 15%, while overall food inflation is up about 3%. But as prices are up sharply at the grocery store, so are the costs for cattle farmers, about 50% over the past 5 years.
The only way you are not operating with a supplemental income is if you are generations down the line and the land has been paid for and the equipment has been paid for and you are able to just raise the cattle.
Demand for beef remains strong. Direct-to-consumer meat company Omaha Steaks gave CNBC a behind-the-scenes look at its operations as it was ramping up for the holiday season.
A box this size of tenderloins costs Omaha Steaks around $1,800. The company says that's up about 25 to 30% from just 2 or 3 years ago.
My margins are not going up. We've actually, interestingly, not raised our prices for about 3 years and 4 months. We're really starting to feel that pressure now, though.
CNBC visited Nebraska, one of the top cattle producing states in the country, to understand why beef prices are soaring and why it's become so expensive for producers to raise cattle.
This is Talon Linneman. He is the co-owner of the family-owned Linetics Ranch. About 30% of his cattle are sent to the meat supply chain, and the other 70% end up as seed stock, which is essentially just a fancier word for cattle used for breeding.
We are trying to improve the genetic makeup of each cow just by selecting the best cow with the best mom. And it's selecting Michael Jordan's dad with Michael Jordan's mom and making Michael Jordan.
Breeding is especially important right now. The start of 2025 saw the lowest U.S. cattle herd in nearly 75 years.
We've got a larger decline in cow numbers than we do in beef production, and that's because we've just been growing the animals bigger, so we're producing more beef per animal. We take that smaller supply and then the very strong domestic demand for our beef, but those two things are what's driving beef prices higher. Just simple the fact that consumers want the beef and there's not as much of it out there, and we increase prices of a good to ration its consumption.
Calves are typically born in the spring, and after 3 to 7 months, ranchers decide whether to keep the animal for breeding or sell it into the meat system. Severe drought can greatly impact that decision.
Did not having these green pastures affect your feeding costs?
Yes, substantially. Summer grass is actually dormant right now, and so this winter grazing is great, but it only happens when you have enough moisture.
When there isn't enough grass, ranchers will often supplement with grain. And while the price of grain has come down significantly over the past couple of years, it's still an added cost that farmers may not normally account for.
It's the big question right now for our producers. They have a 50-50 decision to make. Do we sell these cattle off into the supply system or do we hold them back? And I think when the money's on the table, there's an incentive to go ahead and sell those through the food supply system, especially when demand is so high from the consumer. But our producers are always looking long term.
We still have to breed the animals. We have to build the herd. We are in for late 2027 before we really see any downward movement in beef prices in America. That is a long time yet.
The natural expansion and contraction of the national herd is called the cattle cycle. It's simply supply and demand. When producers can get higher prices for cattle, they will likely retain more females for breeding. Then, of course, when supply increases, prices collapse, and again, the herds contract. This cycle typically takes 8 to 12 years.
Last year, when cattle prices started inching higher, if we'd have had adequate rainfall across most of cattle producing states, there would have been retention to start growing the herd last year. But it got dry at the exact wrong time. They went ahead and sold them because they weren't going to have the feed resources.
The beef industry is less vertically integrated than, say, the poultry industry, where one company can more easily hatch, raise, and slaughter its own chickens. Cattle, on the other hand, are typically bought from a feedlot. But raising a chicken can be done in as little as 6 weeks, whereas it typically takes 18 to 22 months to raise a calf for meat. So it's much more difficult for one company to control all parts of that operation. That is why there are so many producers that specialize in different aspects of the industry.
Hogs and poultry both have heavily grain-based systems, so they can be fed in confinement their whole lives. Beef cattle, not so much.
But the profit margin for raising cattle is often razor thin.
When you put in all your inputs of feed, equipment, labor, the margin, most producers are hoping to make $100 to maybe $200 per head. They are hardy, very resistant animals, but that's not being said that one won't just up and die. She could have a heart attack. She could get struck by lightning. There are so many different variables that just all your profit's gone.
One lost cow, you have to sell dozens more.
Yep.
Despite high prices, demand for beef has continued to trend upwards over the past decade.
Normally you see prices inflate, you see demand really go down, and that's that sort of economic relationship between supply and demand. But consumers in America love beef, period.
We have improved the quality of beef over the last few years tremendously. A few years ago, you'd be lucky to have 2 or 3% of the beef on the market would be prime. Now it's creeping up there in the 10 or 12%.
Prime is the USDA's highest grade for a cut of beef, defined by the amount of marbling or fat streaking within the meat. Omaha Steaks told CNBC that when it comes to purchasing its inventory, it can typically beat the spot market, meaning the commodity price, by 20 to 25%.
We can buy it at prices that are competitive because we leverage freezing technology, and we can build inventory over a long period of time. Just down the hall right here are huge freezers where we're storing hundreds of millions of dollars in beef, ready to sell to America when Christmas time comes around. So we're building up that inventory.
These flash freezers help preserve the flavor and quality of the beef, whereas a slower cooling process may cause damage to the beef at the cellular level. Freezing allows Omaha Steaks to stock up on inventory when prices are low. It says that has allowed it to avoid raising prices for over 3 years.
At what point does that become unsustainable?
We're getting close. I mean, the market is starting to hit, it's all-time highs now, which means if it continues to go up, every day we're setting records. We're looking internally all the time. How can we find efficiencies? How can we invest in our business to drive more volume for less cost? But there is some breaking point, right? There is some point at which the raw material that we need is at a price point that we're gonna have to start passing some of that on.
Omaha Steaks doesn't actually slaughter any cattle. That is done by the meatpacking industry. Around 85% of the market is dominated by 4 major players. On November 7th, President Trump accused the major meatpacking companies of colluding to drive up prices. The Attorney General announced an investigation was underway, but these allegations are nothing new. Tyson, Cargill, and JBS paid tens of millions of dollars in 2025 to settle lawsuits filed in 2019 for allegedly having restricted supply to inflate U.S. beef prices. The packing companies have denied wrongdoing in their respective cases. All 4 companies did not respond to CNBC's request for a comment. Omaha Steaks purchases most of its beef from the major packers. It arrives here at its butchery, where ground beef is turned into burgers, and steaks, like top sirloins and filet mignons, are carved up and packaged.
This is the central fulfillment center for Omaha Steaks. Once all the beef gets processed and packaged, it goes inside these giant coolers and gets shipped off to the consumer.
When coronavirus hit, it was one of the best things for beef that the beef industry didn't know it then. They could prepare a good high quality steak at home and they enjoyed eating it. Well, that has persisted. And ever since that, we have just seen demand of beef very, very strong.
Omaha Steaks says it does nearly 50% of its business during the last quarter of the year. In mid-December, it says it will be shipping 90,000 coolers out of this facility each day.
So much of your business comes in the last few months of the year, around the holiday season. Is the goal to spread out some of that demand to other parts of the year?
Absolutely. I want to de-risk the business. Having a huge spike in holiday is certainly fun, but it's hard to sleep at night. Let's just say that.
Imported beef accounts for a relatively small but growing percentage of the overall U.S. supply. In October, in an attempt to lower grocery store prices, President Trump announced he would be quadrupling imports with lower tariff rates from Argentina. However, typically only ground beef is imported.
In reality, when he's saying, we're going to reduce beef prices, really the only price that he's really might have an influence on would be ground beef prices. And I don't really think he's going to have much impact on ground beef prices in the short run. What's going to finally bring these prices down is once we ramp up production and we actually start retaining these females and they start producing something.
But the announcement to increase shipments from Argentina could have political motivations. It came as President Trump was working to help the country bolster its collapsing currency ahead of the midterm elections, where his close ally, President Javier Milei, won in a landslide victory on October 27th. Despite lowering tariffs for Argentina, the president has placed tariffs on countries like Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, and Uruguay, all of which the U.S. relies on for beef. Brazil, which accounted for 15% of imports in 2024, was hit with a 40% tariff on beef in July. Reuters reported that the tariffs on Brazil were to punish the country for its prosecution of its former president, who was an ally of President Trump. Those have since been rolled back.
With the fluctuation in market so much, it really hurt some producers because it crashed that market. Even though no consumer saw a crash in price, but as producers, we saw a large decline in our pricing.
An outbreak of the flesh-eating parasite called screwworm has also affected the cattle herds in Mexico, which accounted for 13% of beef imports in 2024. The U.S. has had a ban on most livestock imports from there since May. Even though imports are mainly used for ground beef, it's still an important part of the U.S. supply. Beef imports are projected to increase by 16% in 2025.
The cost per pound of ground beef sets the tone for the entire beef market, and that really sets the feeling for how much does meat cost.
The U.S. government says it's trying to help farmers build domestic herds, but that's not a simple task. The USDA proposal to fortify the American beef industry includes policies like expanding grazing lands, predator management, and disaster prevention support.
In the longer run, yes, it would result in a more resilient beef supply. We're talking about 3 years or more out, but it can't change anything today.
We have got to build the herd, period. We have to have a long-term outlook on what we want beef prices and protein prices to look like in this country as we near 2030. If something doesn't change, if we're short-term minded, then we're going to have a much bigger problem 2 years from now than we have right now.